Hi, this is Fatih, and today I'm going to talk about Rakkas, a full-stack React framework powered by Vite. Now, about 2 years ago, I had this idea for a web application. It was going to be a greenfield project, so I would get to choose each and every piece of the tech stack to my own liking. And I started with React because I use React at work every day, and it's the only framework I know inside out. I also went with Next.js because I needed server-side rendering, and Next.js at the time was the only real option. For this particular project, I needed localized URLs, and I remembered vaguely from the documentation that Next.js supported them. But turns out that it does support n/about and fr/about, which is frankly not that useful. I needed n/about and fr/apropos. And Next doesn't really support that. I mean, it's possible to implement it. You can implement it yourself, but you would be cutting against the grain and fighting the framework all the time. Also, at about the same time, I was playing around a lot with Sapper. It's like the predecessor of SvelteKit. And it had this beautiful concept called layouts, refactoring the common bits of pages like the header and the navigation and the footer and things like that. And I realized that I missed that feature a lot at Next.js. Next supports them now, but at the time it didn't. The support is very recent. So because of these two lacking features and some other grievances, I did what every sane developer would do and started writing my own framework. Now, my initial attempts with Webpack and later Parcel didn't really produce anything useful, but a few months later, I encountered Vite, and within just hours, I had something usable, and within weeks, I released the first version of Rakkas. Because Rakkas is based on Vite, it has out-of-the-box support for TypeScript and CSS modules and CSS preprocessors like Sass, Less, and Stylus, and also a lightning-fast dev server with instant service start and hot module replacement. It also supports React's fast refresh, which is a feature of React that keeps your component state even after a hot module replacement. Now, I wasn't going to talk about these features because this is ViteConf, and I can picture some of you rolling your eyes and thinking that, duh, of course you support HMR, this is Vite. But I think this is taking things for granted because, for example, Remix, which is probably the most important contender to Next.js, doesn't support fast refresh or HMR of any kind. And although Next does support them, I've seen Dan Abramov himself struggling for weeks publicly on Twitter to make Next.js's fast refresh work with Markdown and MDX files, which is obviously trivial in Vite-based frameworks. So maybe this little demo is not as out of place as you might think, because some non-Vite people may be watching us and maybe they realize what they've been missing out on all this time. So it's based on Vite and it's based on React. So and Rakkas supports some of the cutting-edge features of React that few other frameworks support at the moment. One of them is suspense for data fetching. Suspense is a way for React to interrupt the rendering process and wait for some external event. That external event is usually you fetching some data, and when your data is ready, it can pick up where it left. And it really facilitates things like data fetching. Another important React feature that Rakkas supports is the concurrent mode. The concurrent mode means that React can render another component tree in the background while still showing the old component tree in the foreground and keep it responsive, keep it interactive. And when the background render is ready, it can just swap that render with the foreground, and it is really, really useful for implementing things like routing. Yet another newish React feature that Rakkas supports is streaming SSR. Streaming SSR is server-side rendering, but instead of waiting for the whole page to render and send the fully rendered HTML, React and Rakkas can start sending bits and pieces of HTML as soon as they're ready. And if it encounters a suspense boundary, it can just send a placeholder. And when the data is ready, it can render the actual content and send that to the browser on the same stream. And it also sends a little piece of JavaScript to put that newly rendered HTML to the correct place in the page. So this way your users start seeing meaningful content immediately. Now, of course, streaming SSR has some problems with SEO, search engine optimization, because it has to run some JavaScript, also some bits arrive out of order. But Rakkas implements something called dynamic rendering. It basically looks at the user agent, and if it's a search engine or a robot, it waits until the whole stream is ready, so it sends a full page, still with full support for suspense for data fetching. So now about the greenfield project that I started 2 years later. 2 years later, 2 years ago, 2 years later, I still don't have anything useful. All I have is a non-functioning login form. But I have Rakkas, and localized routes aren't really supported in Rakkas either, not currently. Actually, they were supported in the previous version, but it didn't make it to the current version yet. I'm still working on porting them, so hopefully by the time you see this talk, they're going to be already available. So no localized URLs yet, but Rakkas does support layouts. It is a file system router, similar to other frameworks, but I'm also working on a configuration-based router. The file system router, with the file system router, you name your pages with the .page.tsx or JSX suffix. This explicit naming scheme allows you to have your helper files and other files next to your pages without accidentally exposing them as routes. And layouts apply to pages in the same directory or its children. If you want a couple of pages, a group of pages to share the same layout without necessarily sharing a common URL prefix, you can name your directories with names that start with an underscore. Then those directories will not contribute to the URL path name. You can use the same trick in your pages, because it's kind of confusing to have lots of index.page files open in your editor. This way you can just give them meaningful names. Rakkas' router also supports route guards. Route guards are for restricting access to certain pages. They can apply to a single page, or they can apply to a group of pages, and they can redirect or rewrite the URL, or also they can just completely disallow access to a certain URL. And they are useful for implementing things like not allowing access based on the user's login status or some other condition. I talked about, if you've seen my short talk earlier, I talked about Rakkas' data fetching system, and I said that it's inspired by React query, now called 10-stack query. In the meantime, in the short amount of time between recording that talk and this talk, I actually managed to make React query work with Rakkas. So I'm not sure the verdict is still out whether we should keep the Rakkas implementation which is smaller and simpler and offer React query as an extension alternative, or complete the React query completely and do away with maintaining a parallel data fetching system. But in any case, if you are familiar with React query, Rakkas has the familiar use query and use mutation APIs, but it also has something called use server-side query, which runs your query function on the server. Now, this use server-side query is based on a not yet documented API called run server-side, which is not necessarily tied to Rakkas. So one day we might have the same feature working for Vue, Svelte, and Solid, and other frameworks, and also in Next.js and Remix maybe. For mutations, again, we have use mutation, and we have the mutation counterpart use server-side mutation. There's a slight flaw with use server-side mutation and use mutation. They require JavaScript. As you know, Remix kind of repopularized HTML forms, and Rakkas also offers form actions, basically mainly copied from Remix. But for page actions are tied to pages, and Rakkas's data fetching methods are not really tied to pages, and I think it's an important feature because you can have self-contained components. So for that reason, we're working on a new thing called use form mutation, which is similar to use server-side mutation. The API may change a little, but it's going to be similar to this. It's called use form mutation, and it uses HTML forms to communicate with the server, and it works even without JavaScript. Now you may think it's 2022, who doesn't have JavaScript? But you know, JavaScript is sometimes late to load, so you want your app to work even before JavaScript finished loading, if that makes sense. So I talked a little about what features are in Rakkas. Now I want to talk about what features are not in Rakkas, at least not in Rakkas core anymore, because some of the features that used to be bundled with Rakkas are now separate projects in their own right, and this is no coincidence. Like I said, everything that could live outside of Rakkas should live outside of Rakkas. So I'm hoping that user server-side query and the underlying run server-side query will be hopefully available in other frameworks too. So anyway, the first project that broke off of Rakkas is called Vite. It's a set of utilities to develop and build server-side applications with Vite. Now, Vite is basically a front-end framework, but it does have support for transpiling server-side code too. As illustrated by Vitest, is actually very good at it too. So Vite just uses Vite to transpile your server-side code, and which is not necessarily a server-side rendering code. It can be just a pure server application, and it has integration examples for Express, Koa, Hoppy, and Festify, and even Nest.js, which is kind of tricky to integrate with. The second project that broke off of Rakkas is called HeadTip. We're working on it with Ron Brilot of Vite plugin SSR fame. HeadTip is like Express in that it's an HTTP framework, and also it's minimal and unopinionated like Express, but it's also not like Express at all, because it's modern, as in it's based on web standards, the fetch API and request and response objects, and web streaming API. It's also very modular in that you can use as little or as much as you want. But most importantly, it's universal. It aims to run wherever JavaScript runs. Right now it runs on server runtimes like Node and Dino and Bun, and also on edge runtimes like Cloudflare Workers and Vercel Edge and Netlify Edge, and also on Vercel and Netlify serverless functions. A service worker implementation is also in the works. So the idea is that to have middleware, like think of Express middleware, but think that they run everywhere. So you have your, I don't know, authentication middleware that runs on any JavaScript engine, or you have your little web application that runs on any JavaScript engine, and Rakkas actually rides on that. So Rakkas can run on almost all of those JavaScript engines that HeadTip runs on, and in that you can think of HeadTip kind of like SvelteKit adapters or Remix adapters, but not tied to Rakkas or any particular framework. It can run with plugin SSR with no problem, and it can run actually anything as long as you're just careful to use its APIs. It can run any kind of framework on any of those JavaScript runtimes. So these are what we have currently in Rakkas land, but we also have some future plans. One of them is splitting the layers. You know, I talked about HeadTip and can run on Edge runtimes and server runtimes, and it can enable you to write applications that are split into layers. I mean, all web applications are split into layers, and the main break between those layers is between the client and the server. But with the invention of edge workers, which are basically smart CDNs, you can have web applications where some of the code runs on the client and some of the code runs on the server service workers, and some of it runs on the edge and some of it runs on the origin. So you can handle some of the routes on the edge close to the user, and you can run some of your routes on the origin close to your database. So wherever it makes sense. And we can have a unified approach to this kind of thing. And Vercel and Netlify offer something like this with their Edge plus serverless function offerings. But I'm hoping that with HeadTip, Rakkas is going to be, you will be able to deploy this kind of split layer Rakkas applications to any kind of Edge runtime plus your any kind of origin server. Another set of ideas to explore in the future is to support other Vue frameworks. There's already a mostly function Preact example. It's not 100% yet because Preact doesn't support concurrent mode, which Rakkas's router depends on currently. But if you don't mind giving up client-side navigation, it's all other features work well. So I know Solid.js has some concurrent features, so it's on my radar. I'm trying to make Rakkas work with Solid.js too, but it's still very early experiments currently. Another idea that could be explored in the future is using other backend languages than JavaScript. I mean, your server-side query is great, but you could also just put your backend code in your JavaScript code, even if your backend wasn't in JavaScript. So I have this project called PHP Tag. It's only a half joke. It lets you run backend PHP code that you put in tagged template literals, but the reception, let's say the reception was lukewarm, not enthusiastic. But I joke aside, I still think with some editor support, it can be a really valuable area of research in the future. Currently, Rakkas is not production ready because some of the features it relies on are not production ready anyway. I think Rakkas needs a lot of users right now so that we can understand the pain points, what works and what doesn't work. So please go ahead and try. Thank you.